What I'm going to do in the next sort of 45, 50 minutes is provide a synthesis of 10 years of storm research conducted at Plymouth University. And so I'm going to start with acknowledging all the people that contribute to this. And it's obviously the fellow academics, but I particularly want to acknowledge Peter Ganderton, who's been helping out with the technical support for the last 10, 15 years. And we have excellent PhD students that go through the system. You can sort of imagine we've had about 10, 15 in the last 10 years. And without the PhD students, none of this research would have been conducted. So let's set this up. Okay, so my talk is a bit like a meat sandwich, I guess. The middle bit is all about coastal impacts of extreme storms. But I'm a geographer by trade, and I'd like to give a larger scale and a longer term context as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change at the beginning, and I'll talk about the Atlantic storm wave climate, because that's what drives everything that's in the middle bit. And then, because I'm also a geographer at the end of my talk, I want to talk a little bit about so what we know about vulnerability of coastlines. It's going to get worse, the storm impacts, so what can we do about it? So I'm going to talk briefly about the various strategies available to adapt to the changes that are undoubtedly around the corner. So we're going to start with this one. So this is a map of the change in Earth's surface temperature for the last 100 years, and it's mainly red. So two blue bits, which is the melting of cool water being added to the ocean. But we see overwhelmingly our Earth is warming, about 0.8 degrees centigrade. That's what we've seen in the last sort of 100 years. You may have heard of tipping points. 1.5 degrees is a tipping point, and maybe 2 degree increase is a tipping point. We're halfway the first tipping point, hence the alarmist attitude of climate scientists. We need to do something about it. We're halfway the first tipping point. Now, it has lots of consequences, but for me as a coastal geomorphologist, my main interest is in sea level rise and the effect that this has on sea level. So as the Earth has been warming, we've seen about a foot, maybe 20 centimeters of sea level rise over the same period. It's not a lot, 20 centimeters over that same period. But that's going to change into the future. Now, the Met Office have recently upgraded the global predictions for sea level change. And they use 3 different scenarios. And these curves show the predicted sea level rise over the next 100 years. I call that sort of the scenario whereby we drastically reduce our CO2 emissions, peak and decline. That's the one where we're making some efforts. We're stabilizing our outputs by 2100, and that's the Donald Trump scenario. Is the burn and crash or crash and burn. There's actually not that much difference in the sort of average increase by 2100, but I'd like to draw your attention to the shape of the curve. That's a declining curve, slightly flattening towards 2100. This is almost straight, but slightly increasing, but this one's exponentially increasing. So the difference between these 3 scenarios are really going to be brought out in 2200, 2300. Now, the other impact of climate change is, you'll hear it often, is a change in storminess. Now, for tropical hurricanes, cyclones and typhoons, I think the literature is saying, yes, there will be an intensification of the hurricane strength. We might see a category 6 hurricane in the future. For our sorts of storms, we don't get hurricanes and typhoons. We get these weather coming from the Atlantic. Actually, that's not very clear what's going to happen. And this is again from the UK, the Met Office predictions. They're predicting, blue is good, a reduction in the mean wave height due to climate change with quite a lot of confidence. But this is the extreme wave height that they're predicting. Some areas will see a reduction in the extreme wave height. REC will see an increase in the extreme wave height. But for the southwest, which is why we're interested, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty about it. So we don't really know whether we are going to be affected by increased storminess due to climate change. But it's important to bear in mind that actually, even without changes in the storminess, we are going to see an increase in impacts of storms. It sounds like a contradiction. I'm going to demonstrate to you why that is. We've developed an operational storm model, a coastal flooding model for the southwest. So we use wave data coming in, wind data, tidal data, and then we predict 3 days in advance the chance of coastal flooding in the southwest. And we indicate, by colors, we indicate the different sort of risk levels. What these 2 patterns show, these 2 pictures, are a forecast for Storm Eleanor that happened earlier last year. It was a westerly storm event, which was very big in Scotland, but not very big in the southwest. There's a little bit of flooding predicted. And Storm Emma, that was on the back of the beast from the east last year, brought all the snowfall. A lot of people forget, because we're obsessed with the snow, that at the back of it, we were hit by the largest easterly wave event since, well, probably since the 60s. Really big storm events. And this is what we were predicting: flooding, extensive flooding of this part of England. Now, the model does a reasonably good job, so you can sort of accept that this is what actually happened as well. If we rerun these two events, same wave conditions, but we lift the sea level by a meter, we're going to get this picture. So just go backwards and forwards. You see that even without any changes in the storminess or storm characteristic, just by lifting the sea level, we are drastically increasing the flood risk. So Eleanor all of a sudden affects the whole of the southwest, and Emma affects the whole of the south coast. So the point is that we're going to get extreme impacts of storm events even without storms getting more intense, purely because the water level is rising. Okay. So now we've got a spatial overview. Atlantic wave climate. If we get weather in winter, rain and wind, often mild as well, the weather we're getting in the southwest in a way is quite simple, because we get all the bad stuff from the Atlantic. If we get good weather, it's because the Atlantic is not bringing anything. So we want warm weather in the summer, or these nice crispy frosty days. That's because the Atlantic is not bringing stuff. And the Atlantic climate is controlled, dominated by a climatological phenomenon called the North Atlantic Oscillation. And that climate mode that drives our weather is characterized by a high pressure system over Spain and the Azores, and a low pressure system in Iceland. I'm sure you've heard of the Azores high and the Icelandic low. That is a dominant mode of climate. And that is associated with a very strong westerly airflow. So air is going from America, flowing across the Atlantic towards us, driven by these two high and low pressure in the middle. Now, if that pressure difference is larger than average, so extra high and extra low, that would bring extra strong winds, extra strong waves, and also more and more rainfall. That's called a positive NEO. So phase of positive NEO, bad news for us. Or we can have a negative NEO. We still have high here, we still have low there, but it's not as pronounced. It's the weakening of this main driver of our weather. We still have the westerlies. They tend to be moved a little bit further to the south. But we also can get some easterlies coming in now, because easterlies we don't get under this regime because the westerlies are too strong. So the negative NEO, we see less bad winters, severe winters, less rainfall. We can get these nice cold, crispy days in winter when the easterly airflow sets in. So a negative NEO controls our weather. Now they think that's great, because if we know what the NEO is doing, then we know what the weather's doing. Now, unfortunately, this is a long-term time series of NEO, therefore winter wave climate. For the southwest, it just jumps up and down like a yo-yo. Not much you can see in there. There's a phase here, lots of negative in the 60s and the 70s. Maybe some of the elder people in the audience may remember. Maybe very cold winters then. And then we have a phase of positive, very wet conditions here, very wet conditions that we've been having the last 5-6 years. But it's not very clear what's happening. What is interesting, there is actually a trend. If we ignore the early bit, there does seem to be a trend towards more positive NEOs, meaning stronger westerly airflows, milder winters, and wetter winters. So maybe there's something in there. Okay, so I'm telling you that NEOs related to the wave conditions. Let's prove this first. This is a map that shows a correlation, statistical correlation between the winter wave conditions, the winter wave height, and the value of the NEO. So if what I'm saying is right, it means positive NEO means large waves, means a positive correlation means red. That's exactly what's happening. So this whole area of the Atlantic, NEO very strongly controls what sort of wave conditions we're getting. If we have a very strong positive NEO, we get big waves in this area. This is blue, is a negative correlation. We actually get small waves in this area, and vice versa. So that's nice, that works. NEO is a good proxy for wave conditions. I demonstrated an increase in NEO over time, maybe due to climate change, but certainly there is an increase. So there should be an increase in wave conditions as well. This is the same area, same sort of map. Now this area here shows if there is a trend in the wave conditions. Red is bad. If we see dark red color, that means there's an increasing trend in wave conditions. Waves getting bigger and bigger over time. And indeed, because NEO is getting bigger in time, this area is affected by an increase in wave conditions as well. And if you look at the numbers, what it translates to for the southwest is sort of around 10 to 15 millimeters per year. Basically means that over a 50-year period, which is over which this is calculated, that over that 50-year period, the maximum wave height has got about half a meter higher. Now those are significant changes. So we are seeing an increase in wave conditions. The Met Office is not predicting an increase in wave conditions. Right, so that's the background, that's the context. So 2013-14 was a real wake-up call for people like me. We started a research project in 2012 where we were going to chase storms. We were going to catch storms. We were going to measure the conditions before the storm, during the storm, and after the storm. We spent a lot of money building a van and getting all the equipment together. In 2011-12, nothing happened. 2012-13, not a lot happened. Fortunately, 2013 was literally a wake-up call for us because we were out every other week. We were out catching these storms. It was also a wake-up call for the coastal communities, even, and also at a national level, actually. I'll talk more about that in a minute. Because this was, as I'll show you later, the most severe winter we've had since the 1950s. And this is a shot from Port Leven. This is what a lot of photos at the end of this winter. And this is what happened a lot. A lot of beaches got sand and gravel thrown onto into the city or into the towns, onto the car parks. A lot of beaches lost all their sand and were turned into what you would call wave-cut platforms. And if you take the sand away, you get the collapsing coastal defences, very, very widespread. The watering hole in PERRANPORTH turned almost into an island. A lot of coastal flooding in the south coast, Looe, Seaton, places like that. And then Jerry referred to the railway as well. Now that was by far the most expensive impact. 60 days the railway was not open, and the cost is estimated to anywhere between 1 million and 20 million per day. That's an economic estimate of not having the railway. That sums up to anywhere between 60 million pounds and 1.2 billion pounds, anywhere in the middle, probably a couple of £100 million, the cost of having that railway not open for 2 months. So really big impacts. And not surprisingly, if we actually look what the wave conditions were, the top panel shows a time series. I'll show you a little movie, shows the different wave fields and the wave patterns moving across the Atlantic. So when you see a big blue blob, blue is bad in this one, dark blue is very bad. These are basically these big latitude storms either generated here or there, and they just one after the other. You can see one after the other. In January, February, it was every week there was one. And this is our storm chasing season. If we look at them, we're going to look at two in particular. It's called Hercules, is the one that did most damage on the north coast. And it wasn't the biggest storm. There were bigger ones in February. But it did most damage because it was a very large weather system, very large storm, a very long period, the longest period of all the storms. And power, wave power, is a function of height and period. It was also a storm that coincided with spring high tide. And the higher the water level the storm hits, the more the impacts, hence my early slides, that if you have sea level rise, it affects the impacts of the storms. And the other storm that was mainly affecting the south coast is Petra, which actually was a little one, a minion amongst giants, one of the smallest ones, much smaller area as well. But you can see the difference, the marked difference between the two, whereas Hercules came straight from the west, Petra came from the southwest, and therefore was able to sneak into the channel much easier because it wasn't protected by Land's End in a way. So that was a very impactful storm on the south coast for two reasons. One, it had a different direction, so it had bigger waves on the south coast, but also it hit the coastline largely under an angle. And so you've all heard littoral drift and long coast sediment transport. We're going to talk about that later. Whereas this one hit the beaches straight on, this one hit the beaches under an angle. Now I say it was the most energetic winter in living history. Is that really true? Well, it was really true because we did some modeling and some combining model data with measured wave data. This is a 50-year time series of a sort of a smooth, a 2-month average wave condition. And you can see the winter the wave goes up, summer the waves go down. So the maximum peak that we had in 2015, we had a wave height of 4.5 meters averaged over 2 months. That's never happened before. Maybe the one that comes closest is the 1990 winter. Again, some of the elder people that maybe in the fishing industry may remember this 1990 winter, which was really bad. So it was definitely the most energetic winter since in a generation. So that's good. So how do we then go about measuring impacts? How do we measure, how do we learn about what these storms do to our beaches? And how do we then apply that what we've learned? So we do a lot of work, primary data collection, and we also do a lot of using data that's already collected by other people. So in terms of secondary data collection, we use a lot of data collected and collated by the Plymouth Coast Observatory. There's a couple of people in the audience here, but it's a sort of a unique service that you have in the UK, is that local councils and environment agencies team together, big pot of money, and then they basically commission a lot of data collection in the coast. They collect data on waves, they collect data on tides, wind, beach profile data, aerial photography, a whole bunch of data, and it's all freely available on the web. So we use a hell of a lot of that sort of data. Particularly useful is what's called LIDAR data. I'm going to show you an example. LIDAR stands for light detection and ranging. It's basically a plane flies over a coastal landscape and measures the topography. If you do that before the storm, then after the storm you measure the topography again. You get two surfaces, you subtract the two surfaces, and you have a difference plot, a plot that shows the difference in morphology, how much erosion has happened and how much accretion and sedimentation has happened. I'm showing you this one from America because America, they're really big on LIDAR data because they use it to look at the impacts of hurricanes. So they go before the hurricane and after the hurricane. And this is a LIDAR image, a difference plot of Hurricane Katrina. And the photo is there to help you interpret what you're looking at. So this is probably 2 kilometers of barrier. That's another kilometer. The pink area, so pink is bad, red is also bad, very bad, in fact. That's basically the waves washing over the barrier, taking the sand from the beach and the top of the beach, and then washing the sand into the lagoon behind in the green color. Right? You can see the erosion here, and then the deposition in here, these massive sort of called washover lobes. Why I like this picture is because it's got all these nice red squares. These are all the houses that has basically been taken out by Katrina. So initially the LIDAR would hit the roof, and now it hits the surface, so you get a big red spot. And but particularly interesting are the little green ones, because those are basically houses that are literally picked up from the old place and put somewhere else. More houses destroyed than moved. So it's really useful to look at storm impacts if you have that sort of data, and I'll show you plenty of examples of that. We also go out ourselves with our a lot of survey we do, either on foot, quad bike, boat. That's sort of the old style. We increasingly move towards drones or UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles, which are not quite as accurate as these methodologies, but a normal survey would give us a couple of hundred, a couple of thousand of points. With this technique, this gives us hundreds of thousands of points. So we get much larger area with a very small compromise in terms of accuracy. And what we can do then, if we combine these different techniques, we can do what we call the total sediment approach. So we're trying to almost count every single sand grain in a coastal system and how the amount of sand changes. So we survey the dunes with the UAV, we survey the beach with the quad, we use the boat to do the underwater bit, we survey this in more or less in the same time, and then we blend all these different sets together, and then we have a complete digital elevation model before a winter and after a winter, and we can start summing the amounts of losses and gains. It's not a trivial task, it's a big job. This is where our PhD students come in. But we can answer questions like, okay, this is PERRANPORTH. If this is the part that's active, the whole beach, all the sand is constrained within 2 headlands, we have what's called a closed cell. And we know that any changes we measure anywhere in the beach have to be balanced by changes elsewhere in a different direction. If, however, the beach is like this, and we actually have lots of changes in the sediments outside the headlands, or even this, where we have lots of changes in this whole box, we got a little bit coming in and a lot coming out, that completely changes how you would consider the dynamics of a beach like that. If it's a closed system or an open system is actually a very important question for us. So we can do that by doing these really accurate and widespread surveys. Those who've fallen asleep are now up, waken up. We also go out and then basically install a lot of equipment at low tide, and then we let the waves go over it and record it. And then we have this mobile van unit with computers and other equipment in it. And what we do with that, we basically get data from this instrument, which is a laser scanner, and we also have video cameras. And I'll show you what you can do with video cameras. You say, well, what's the point of putting video cameras on the beach? I'm going to show you first, this is Chesil Beach again. What is really important in terms of coastal flooding is not where the water level is, but also how high the waves run up and down the beach. And you can measure that by, basically this is the run-up, goes up and down. So you can record how high the waves run up and down the beach, and then you get a really good indication of what we call wave run-up. you can also do it with a laser scanner. You basically see blue is the beach, there's the seawall, and then the red is the waves coming in and out and in and out. And again, you can work out how high does the wave come up in relation to where the water level is. Now those are measurements that have been made quite universally in a lot of places, but not with 8, 9, 10 meter waves. Because we do that, we went out 10 times this winter, and every dot here is a half an hour measurement, either from the video camera or the laser scanner, of how high do the waves run up and down the beach. What's the maximum level that the waves reach? So that's the maximum extent of the vertical run-up. And we plot that against how big are the waves. And what you see here, that on gravel beaches, these are all measurements on Chesil, that you have 6, 7 meter waves, which is really big. The run-up is 10, 12, almost up to 14 meters. So you sort of get a feeling for how much the wave height in a way is amplified in terms of the run-up. And that's clearly important because it's the wave run-up that results in flooding. It's not the water level going slowly up and down, it's those massive waves that go up and down. Okay, so let's now look at impacts. I'm going to start, I'm a geographer, start large scale, and then I'm going to go middle scale, small scale. So I'm going to start with a regional approach to impacts. I just want to answer the question of, do different regions in the southwest behave differently? And I'm pulling in the data from Plymouth Coast Observatory here. They cover about 30, 35 beaches. They measure every 6 months. Total of 200 profiles. So 200 beach profiles like this before a winter or a storm and after a winter. Now we want to do something with that. We want to somehow quantify, put a number on the impact. Now we can say, oh, this beach was cut back 15 meters. Yeah, but that's here, but that's not the same there. We can say that beach was lowered by 3 meters. Yeah, but only 2 meters there. We want one number per beach. So we basically work out the envelope of change. So we work out what is the area above mean sea level that has changed. In this case, there's an erosion, it's a sediment loss, and we can quantify that. This number means that this particular beach has lost 40 cubic meters, which is about 60 jumbo bags of sand, for a 1 meter strip of beach. So every meter of the beach, this beach lost 40 cubic meters. And this one actually built out, got a lot wider. The number here is 160. Now we have not only do we know that this beach eroded and that beach accreted, but we can also say that this beach accreted 4 times more than this beach eroded. So now we can do things with those numbers. We can compare different beaches, we can compare different storms, we can compare different years. We can look at rates of losses and recovery, all sorts of stuff. We can calculate things. We've got this for this 2013-14 winter for all 200 profiles. I'm going to stack them up, starting at Western-super-Mare. Every little bar is a beach, all the way down North Coast, Land's End, Isles of Scilly, South Coast, all the way down to Chesil. So we've got 200 bars, not bars. Look. Red is bad, these are the losses, and blue is the gains. And we can immediately see there's a huge variability in response, mainly red. Most beaches lost sediment, but there's also some beaches that actually gained sediments. Some beaches benefited from the storms. So why is that? What's explaining this spatial variability? I'm going to zoom in a bit. I'm going to start with Western-super-Mare. That's this little bit. It's the part of the coast that's been affected least. In fact, more winners, more blue than red. What that basically means is that if you've got these big westerly Atlantic swell coming in and hitting the coast here, by the time they reach the coast of Western-super-Mare, they've changed from these destructive waves, they become constructive. They're actually bringing in sediments, adding sand to the beaches. So clearly not particularly vulnerable to westerly storm events. The north coast faces the west full on. This is where the biggest losers are. Some of these beaches have lost 300 cubic meters for a 1 meter strip of beach. It's an enormous amount of sand. That beach is 1 kilometer wide. You've lost 300,000 cubic meters. That beach is 3 kilometers wide. You've lost 1 million cubic meters of sand, or one beach in one winter. Big, big, big numbers. And why? Because it's fully exposed to those big waves. St. Ives is on the Ives Bay is on the north coast. Actually, Ives Bay won. They're the winners. They benefited from the storm. Why is that? Well, Ives Bay is the exception to most beaches on the north coast. In fact, it's facing north. So you've got the Atlantic swell coming in. By the time they bend around and hit the beaches of Ives Bay, they become constructive again. So this again, these are not beaches that are vulnerable or susceptible to westerly Atlantic storm events. On the south coast, more losers than winners, but quite a lot of winners. Numbers are a bit intermediate, but often you see red bars next to blue bars, where you have part of the beach is losing sediment, the other part of the beach is gaining sediment. Now, and that's because of longshore sediment transport. So there's a longshore exchange of sediment, and I'm going to talk more about it later. And then Chesil is on the south coast, is the old one out on the south coast. It actually behaves like a north coast beach. And that's because Chesil is really one of the most exposed beaches on the south coast. It gets the biggest waves. So that sort of nicely makes sense, but it's still a bit crude, isn't it? Like north coast versus south coast, and the exception is Ives Bay and Western Supermare. So we want to be a bit more specific. So now we pull in the LIDAR data. Remember the hurricane data. So the dots are all the reasonably big beaches in the southwest. There's 158 beaches in the southwest. And we've got really good LIDAR data weeks after the 2013-14 storms. And we got really good data either the year before or the year before that. So it's not as tightly constrained as we'd like, but it's good enough. And there's an example. We get the LIDAR data. We combine it with aerial photography. We blank out the bit that's of interest. In this case, it's Fistral Beach and Crantock. Before and after, we subtract these two surfaces, and then we get this is the change map for Fistral, mainly red. The change map for Crantock, a bit of red, also blue. In fact, I don't know if anyone knows, this river changed its course. It used to go along here. After the storms, it went that way. And you can see it's because a whole lot of sediment was dumped in the river. So you can see how you can already see difference between Fistral and Crantock. They're next to one another, completely different response. So a bit of a complicated slide, but actually it's quite straightforward. What we did with all those 158 beaches, 158 different stories of storm response, there are similarities between certain types of beaches. So we use a statistical technique called cluster analysis that takes all those 158 responses and looks for patterns, groups of beaches that behave similar. And we ended up with 4 types of responses, 4 types of beaches within this 158 data set. Type 1 is very much like big losses all over the beach. So the whole beach is red. So sediment was taken from these beaches. Doesn't matter where you were on the beach, anywhere. And that the mechanism of that is mainly taking sediment offshore, taking all the sediment here and dumping it underwater. Type number 2, lots of losses at the top of the beach, but you can see that some of the sediment already got dropped around the low tide mark. So quite energetic offshore transport, but not completely stripping the beaches of sediment, number 2. Number 3, tend to be very small beaches, very small pocket beaches with very unusual orientations. So those are beaches that are virtually unaffected by the storms. So no losses, no gains, and you see no bright blues and no bright reds. And then you've got number 4, where you have losses on one end of the beach and gains on the other end of the beach. So sediment's clearly gone from this part of the beach to that part of the beach. And if we map these different types, again in a geographical context, we get a really nice picture. We see that most of the blues and the reds are on the exposed north coast. Most of the purples, the longshore transport, are mainly on the south coast. And then the limited change one, the red one, is scattered all over the coastline, because whenever you have a small pocket beach, you have the reddest one. Now this is really useful, because not only does this tell you how different beaches behave similarly and differently from one another, it can also say something about how will these beaches recover from the storm. Because number 1 and 2, for that sand to come back onto the beaches, it needs to be moved onshore by calm wave conditions. For beach number 4 to recover from this, it doesn't need calm wave conditions. It actually needs these arrows to go the other way around. It needs a storm from a different direction. So calm conditions are good for 1 and 2, not very good for number 4. Storms from another direction are great for number 4, but not very useful for 1 and 2. So it actually allows you to say something about how the beaches recover as well. So we're going to focus in on 2 beaches, PERRANPORTH and Start Bay. PERRANPORTH is a blue beach. It's a type 1 beach. It's about 3 kilometers long. It's about almost a kilometer wide at spring low tide. It's a very wide beach. It's got an extensive dune system at the northern end, small dune system here. The watering hole is right there. It's got a small river coming in. Waves are mainly from the Atlantic, from the west. It's a beach that we've been looking at for at least 10 years. We go to this beach every month. The PhD students go every month. They went day for yesterday for the last survey. So we've got a really good data set of that particular beach. So what I've plotted here, on the top panel is just the wave heights since 2007. Red bubbles are big storm events. You can sort of see things go up and down. The rectangle is the 2013-14 winter. And this is now the changes in the beach volume driven by these changes in the wave conditions. So we started off with quite an empty, depleted beach. And then that beach sort of recovered over 3-4 years. It goes up and down a bit. In the winter, it goes back, and in the summer, it builds up. We can see that this beach recovered back. In 2012, it was back where it sort of should be. Then we had 2 years, 2 average years with up and down in the winter and the summer. Then we had the 2014 winter, and then we had a big drop. And then we see the recovery. We're probably 60% there. So 4 years after the big storms of 2013-14, we need onshore sediment transport to bring the sand back. We're 60% there. We still have a couple more years of recovery to go. If we get a particularly energetic winter, we almost drop back to where we were. So it gives a really good sort of insight in how these beaches behave in the long term. But that's only looking at this section. It's only looking at this part of the beach. But what about this part of the beach? What about the underwater part of the beach? What about this total sediment budget approach that I talked about? We haven't got that every month because it probably takes a month to do this. But we do have a really good picture showing the changes that happen over the 2013-14 winter. So this is the top of the beach. It's all red. So across the whole beach, sediment was lost. And we see here the blue. So a lot of that sediment has been dropped at 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 meters water depth, maybe even 50 meters water depth. We see this really bright red band is the erosion of the dunes, right here. And we can then sum, if we add all the red together, we have the total amount of losses. If we add all the blue bits together, we know how much gains we've had, and we can balance the budget. It's like a bank account. You've got your incomings and your outgoings, and if you have a trustworthy bank, you should come out with incomings should be outgoings. Does it happen here as well? Well, actually, it doesn't at all. We lost almost 1 million cubic meters from the top of the beach and the dunes. We gained 600,000, so there's about 300,000 cubic meters is sort of missing from the budget. Now, this method is not 100% exact. There's an error margin, and this could almost be due to error. Right? So we're not going to say much about that. We're looking at the recovery period. We can see now that the waves are pushing the sand from the bottom of the beach to the top of the beach, as you'd expect, because the beach is recovering. We do the sums. We gained 1.15, over 1 million cubic meters. We lost about 500,000. We actually gained in this whole area, this box, we've gained more than 500,000 cubic meters of sand. Maybe it doesn't mean much to you, but that means a hell of a lot to a coastal geomorphologist like myself. That's an enormous amount of sand that we cannot account for in the box. Now, there's only one answer, really. It must have come from outside the box. And that really challenges the way we think about these beaches, because we think they are closed sediment cells. You lose something from one end of the beach, it goes to the other end of the beach, and vice versa. But clearly, there's probably stuff going around the corner, here maybe, or maybe there. So really, we're very disappointed by this result, because it's a bad result. We cannot balance the budget for this beach, PERRANPORTH. It basically means that we cannot balance the budget probably for any beach on the north coast. Probably tells us that different beaches on the north coast, they communicate with one another through sediment. There's beaches can gain sediment from erosion of one beach and vice versa. It's not the greatest story. It's a much better story for Start Bay. It's a different setting, probably 15 kilometers. It's not sandy beach, it's a gravel beach. Because it's a gravel beach, it's called whole sands, B sands, SLAPTON sands, and Blackpool sands. No one knows why. The waves here come from 2 directions. Either they come from the south, or they come from the east. So it's a completely different system. Not just waves from the west, they have 2 different wave directions. The beach is very steep, because they're made of gravel, they're very narrow. They often have a lagoon behind it. We've been looking at this beach, SLAPTON, for the same amount of time as PERRANPORTH, last 10 years. This is the last complicated slide. So we're zooming in on SLAPTON. This is Start Bay. This is the southern part of SLAPTON. This is the northern part of SLAPTON. Tor Cross is located here, the War Memorial Middle Car Park, and that's a nudist beach. Top panel shows the wave signal. The waves are much smaller here than on PERRANPORTH. PERRANPORTH, we're looking at, this number was 2.5. Here we're looking at 1.5. That's the beach volume, similar as on PERRANPORTH. Now the blue one is the beach volume changes at the southern end. The red one is the beach change at the northern end. And they go up and down. The middle panel gives an indication of where the waves are coming from. if you see a bubble to the north, that basically means waves from the south, moving up in the diagram. If you see things negative, waves are coming from the east in this direction. Now, if you look at these two lines, you see they are very similar, but they're almost flipped. So, for example, whenever this one goes up, that one goes down. And when does that happen? That ever happens when you have a positive flux. When waves are from the south, they move sediment from the south to the north. So one feeds the other. Perfectly fine, long sediment transport. That one is opposite. So this one goes down, that goes up. This goes down, that goes up. This goes down, that goes up. That was the beach from the east, one single storm. So they're opposite directions. They travel in opposite direction. This is an interesting anomaly. What can you do about eroding beaches? Tor Cross lost a lot of sediment during the 2013-14 storm, so they decided to get 25,000 cubic meters of gravel from the northern end, from the nudist beach, plonked on Tor Cross. So I just want you to remember 25,000 cubic meters of sand was taken from this beach, cost £250,000. So keep that in your back of your mind. So that's straightforward, isn't it? Just basically sediment gets taken from here and gets taken to the other part of the beach. But if we actually look at, try and make a sediment budget, we see actually we're losing sediment from almost 3/4 of the beach. There's much more red than blue. So where did the red go? Again, we need to do a total sediment budget approach. We need to look beyond the little bit that we survey. So now we do the full survey across the whole beach, all those 4 gravel beaches, underwater part as well, completely add up all the numbers, we get these sorts of plots. That's the change. That's mainly covering the 2013-14 winter. This period with a really strong fluxes towards the north. And we can see here the losses, and we can see here that the nudist part of the beach gained, but there's more red than blue because actually a lot of it went around the corner onto another beach. So we see here that SLAPTON is not a closed system. It's feeding another beach to the north. So even though there's 4 separate beaches in Start Bay, they're actually more behave like one big beach. But what is really interesting, if we do the sums, we add the blue and the red, we balance the budget exactly. And it's not because Mark had done a better job than Jevers, PhD students. That's not why. It's because it's a different beach. But what it means is that if we do the sums correctly, there's a point here, which again is where the nudist beach starts, where more than 500,000 cubic meters of gravel traveled across this point and fed this part of the beach. So that's 20 times more than the £250,000 spent on trying to recover some of that losses. Then we had a winter 2016-17 with not particularly easterly storms, but we did have some easterly wave action, which was nudging the sediment back from the northern end to the southern end. The amount, about 140,000 cubic meters, was returned from those 500,000. And then we had the beast from the east, which was a single event, probably over 2 days. 2 days easterly wave event, 110,000 cubic meters. Over 2 days, 110,000 cubic meters were moved. So we're not back to where we were. There's still, I can do the sums, 300,000 cubic meters of gravel stored in the sediment here. Now, Blackpool Sands happens to be a private beach, so they can make a lot of money if they sell that. So we see some recovery because we've had some stormy wave conditions from a different direction, but nowhere near to where we want it to be. Okay, so I think I demonstrated to you that impacts are very significant and variable. That storm impacts will increase, not necessarily because of an increase in storminess, but because sea level is going to allow the storms to act larger, higher sections of the coastline. So what can we do about it? And what do we do with a place like this, Tor Cross? So precariously poised on top of a fragile gravel barrier with a £10 million coastal defence already in front of it, on which 2 years ago £3 million was spent just to reinforce the base of it. So what can we do? I'm going to keep this fairly brief. I think I have to make a statement. There's always going to be a place for hard engineering, like this approach of hold the line where it is and throw concrete and blocks and stones at it. No one would consider abandoning London and not put a couple of £1 billion in upgrading the storm surge barrier. No one would consider taking the Plymouth breakwater away. There is a role for hard coastal defences. They're very expensive, but if you have very expensive land to be protected, or think about nuclear power stations, you're not going to mess with that. They are expensive, they can fail, and then you need to repair them. And they also have, probably most importantly, they have adverse effects elsewhere. So you end up protecting one area that almost always has adverse effects on the neighbouring areas. So you've got to take that into account. So there's always going to be a place for that. If you don't want to build hard engineering structures, ugly structures, you can go do a bit more of a soft approach, soft engineering. The term now is building with nature. A lot of this sort of changes in fashions. It's all about labelling. So building with nature is the term now. It used to be beach recharge or beach nourishment. We've been doing it for 20, 30 years. The problem with beach nourishment is, okay, you make the beach healthier and bigger, so you're not actually messing with the sediment system. You basically introduce new sediment into it. Not ugly, but the problem is you've got to maintain beach nourishment. People don't like having to spend a certain amount of money every couple of years because the process will still continue. They don't stop because of a nourishment. You just temporarily halt the erosion. So they've come up with a new thing called mega nourishment. It comes straight from the Netherlands. This is the first mega nourishment. Mega means big. 20 million cubic meters of sand on one location. It cost about 150 million euros. So it's very, very expensive, but it's fantastic because you only have to do this once. That will last 50 to 100 years. And you generate all sorts of interesting things to study. You increase your beach area so you get more tourists coming to it. So that's a good idea. Now, the UK thought that's a good idea. We'll do that. And they thought, well, make it our own. We do it in our own way. So they're going to do 2 million cubic meters and still call it a mega nourishment. That's actually a normal nourishment. I mean, Skegness and Blackpool have been nourished by 1 to 2 or 3 million. But anyway, that's another way of doing it. So rather than casing this in concrete, just add loads and loads of sand or gravel from elsewhere. That's if you're really insisting on protection. Now, the other alternative way is actually, if you do the sums, so this is how much it costs to protect. This is the value of what I'm protecting. I mean, how's it going to stack up? It's like a car. When you have an old car, you need to make a decision at one point not to stop pumping money in your old car. It's not worth it. So it's the same here. No one's going to build a £1 million seawall to protect one house. So you've got to make that balance at some point. So you get managed realignment or managed retreat as an alternative way, which is basically drawing back from the coast. Now you can do this proactive, like before you have to do it. A lot of it was motivated by EU legislation, like the EU Habitats Directive. We were losing lots of salt marshes because of coastal squeeze. We had to compensate for these losses, so what we did, we used formerly reclaimed salt marshes like the Steert Peninsula in Somerset, and we basically breached the seawalls and opened it up to the sea again. Or, in this particular example, at Haysborough, there used to be houses here, used to be protected, spent a lot of money, millions of pounds protecting maybe only 10, 15, 20 houses. At some point, so that's enough is enough. You're going to take the defences away and those people have to be moving somewhere else. That's more reactive, but sensible from an economic, rational point of view. But it's not that easy, those decisions. Go back to Store Cross. I know some people here. I know how much they care about living there and how much they rely on the sea defence and how much they expect the government to keep maintaining the sea defence. But there will be a point that, well, it's our taxpayers' money that will keep the seawall in place. There will be a point when we have to abandon them. But these are really difficult issues where politics and social issue and fairness and compensation all come in. I don't know much about it. The science can tell very clearly what should happen here, but whether the science is going to be followed on is a different issue. Well, I sometimes think it's probably much better just to avoid getting into those sorts of situations in the first place. Just prevention is better than a cure. So I strongly believe in zonation, zoning in the coastal area. Make sure we don't invest more infrastructure into the coastal zone so we don't have to deal with questions like protection, managed realignment and those sorts of things. So this is an aerial photograph of Newquay. Now all these red marked areas are areas that just recently received planning permission. These cliffs don't erode very fast, maybe 5-10 centimetres per year, but certainly most of them will be affected by erosion in the lifetime of the building. And what happens here is that the local council rejects the plan and then Cornwall Council approves the plan. Ives Bay. These used to be changing rooms of this hotel. This is on the beach, right? On the beach. This is beach sand. They're just building 2-3-story apartments on the beach. It's not even on the top of the cliff, it's on the beach. And then they'll have to build sea defences around it already. You know, proactive sea defence. It's just madness. It doesn't make any sense. So I think we should really be thinking much more about having a proper zoning policy. And there is actually something happening in the UK. The National Planning Policy Framework, they now say that local plans will have to consider including a coastal change management area in their plan. And that's a coastal change management area is an area that's likely to be affected by coastal processes due to climate change in the next 50 to 100 years. So whether that's coastal flooding or coastal erosion. And in these coastal change management areas, you can have then very clear policy, like no new build, or no build at all, or whatever you can come up with. You link the policy to the hazard level of the zones that you identify. Now, the Newquay plan has been ahead of most other, almost everyone else. I think the Newquay plan with this particular CCMA, is the pink line, has been approved by the inspector, is now up for a referendum in Newquay. I don't know whether a referendum is a good idea here, but anyway, that's how they do it. Just want to point out a few things. You don't have to do a CCMA in an area that's currently protected, which I think is a bit of a problem. Because by not having a CCMA in an area that's currently protected, you're basically already saying, oh, we're going to keep protecting, which is not so great. There's a variable width, so much wider at Crentock, because these dunes are really eroding very rapidly, so you need a much wider area where you don't build. Fistral erodes slightly less fast, and the cliffs have a very narrow area. They don't really, the CCMA in UK, don't really consider coastal flooding, which I think they should consider. It's not only about erosion. I think at the moment CCMAs are all about erosion and not about flooding. And then we have here, that's the Fistral, and I hope the planning officer for Newquay is not in the audience here, because whoever approved the building of this is just, you know, out of mind. I mean, that's not very nice, is it? I mean, that could easily be set back 30, 40. It's to avoid this sort of stuff happening. And it's interestingly, we're finding out, we're working with several councils on this, and it appears that local councils, when they do the plan, they have to consider the CCMAs. And they can say, well, we have considered it, but we decided not to go ahead with it. So this is not great. So I think there needs to be a bit more. But clearly, this is an instrument that's relatively new. A lot of confusion about how to implement it. And we're involved with, like I said, 3 different councils to help develop these CCMAs. But I certainly think it's a positive step in the right direction in terms of not dealing with current problems, but actually avoiding future problems and not actually putting those problems upon future generations, not locking in our future generations in terms of protecting the coast. So in conclusions, I think we're very vulnerable to sea level rise and extreme storms. I hope I've demonstrated that with the 2014 winter, particularly coastal flooding and erosion. I think importantly, these impacts will increase in time, regardless of whether the storms get more energetic or not. The sea level by itself will allow those storms to reach higher elevations and therefore have more impacts. We learned a lot by this coastal monitoring, and without actually studying the coast, we don't really know much about what's happening and what it demonstrates to us. So there's actually huge geographical and spatial variability in vulnerability. Different beaches, different stretches of coast behave differently, are susceptible to different types of storms and therefore recover differently as well. I think that added understanding, really the idea is to help inform the appropriate adaptation strategies. We're not saying never defend or don't build seawalls. Certain things are, we need to have a balanced opinion about what the best adaptation strategy is. And that's got to be informed by this understanding that we gain by doing the monitoring. And I think in terms of prevention is better than the cure. So I think the CCMA concept, I think it's about 5 years old, but it's slowly seeping down the different council levels. And I think that's be a very valuable instrument, currently very much underused. But I think it's a bit crazy that in Romania they have a 150-meter buffer zone in the Danube Delta. In Greece they've got very strict planning laws about building on the coastal zone, and in the UK we're still building houses 5 meters away from the top of the cliff. I mean, I think we're lagging a little bit behind. So thank you very much.